Hey everyone, this is James bringing you another Italian genre film review. Today I am going to be talking about a giallo, and it's one of the big ones, and the film is Torso, 1973. So the fifth Sergio Martino Gialli, and it's something a little different. I think this one feels, I think most people would agree that this one feels very different from the other four. And again, one of the things I've said in just about all of the Martino episodes is he's always doing something a little different. He doesn't repeat himself an awful lot, even if he has a lot of the same collaborators and people like that. So the quick synopsis on here is a mass serial killer stalks female co-eds. Really, really simple plot. Probably the simplest and the sparest of all of the Martino ones. But he makes up for it in other aspects, specifically the visual storytelling, which I aim to talk a lot about. And it's also a very interesting bridge into the slasher genre. So in fact, if you listen to a lot of the reviews and stuff like that, you could tell that a lot of people are approaching this a bit like a slasher. In fact, that synopsis, things like that, sound exactly like a slasher. You have a mass killer, you have a final girl, you have promiscuous people getting chopped up, and things like that. They show their boobs, they have sex, they get killed. So a lot of like these slasher tropes. What's interesting about this is happening before Halloween. This is happening before Friday the 13th. And Black Christmas came out right around this time. I don't know which one came out first, but regardless, this is very, very early. So what else about this film is different? Well, for one, it doesn't quite have the same level of collaborators as you have on the other four Martino Gialli that preceded this. So you do have two very important collaborators that came along, and other than that, it's a fairly fresh cast, or cast that he isn't necessarily casting in all of his other Gialli. So I mean, like if you watch All the Colors of the Dark and you watch Strange Vice of Mrs. Ward, you're going to recognize a ton of those faces: your Rasimovs, your Fenix, your George Hiltons, yada yada. But in this film, that's not the case. It's a very, very different cast. You have Susie Kendall is probably the biggest lead. You have Luke Miranda, who was in a lot of his Poliziotteschi, so he did work a lot with Martino, but not necessarily in his Gialli. Also notably, this is produced by Carlo Ponti, who is not his brother, Luciano Martino. So Ponti is a very, very famous Italian producer, worked on a lot of different films, some French New Wave stuff, Dr. Gervago, who worked on Antonioni's Blow Up, so worked on a lot of more prestigious ones. So he's definitely probably seen as a little bit more of a prestige producer than someone like Luciano Martino, who produced a lot of my favorite films, but they're definitely more in kind of the genre cult side of things. Ponti definitely produced his share of kind of culty type films too, but I think the films that he's most well known for are probably not those films. So who did he bring along Martino here? Well, one is probably the most important person, most important Martino collaborator, and that is Ernesto Gastaldi, who was the screenwriter for all five that we've talked about. In fact, he is also the screenwriter for the sixth that we will talk about soon, Suspicious Death of a Minor. And he also brought along his cinematographer, who has done just really great work. I love the way Martino's Gialli look in this golden age. Giancarlo Ferrando, who is really, really good and does some equally great work in this film. Some people have said that this is actually Martino's best looking Gialli. I actually don't necessarily agree. I personally like the way Your Vice's Locked Room and All Colors of the Dark look a little bit more. But you know, there are different people are going to have different preferences. For me at least, this is one of those Gialli that I have just outside my top 5 when I did my no caveats list, and for me definitely a top 10 Gialli, and it kind of jockeys between Your Vice's Locked Room and Only Have the Key and Strange Vice of Mrs. Ward as my favorite of the Martino films. It's also probably the most seen Martino one, and you will kind of note that a lot of people do approach this as more of a slasher, and some people will approach it more from the Gialli angle of things, which is the way that I approached it first. For me, at least, I have a much greater love for Gialli than slashers. I think they're more interesting, and so yeah, I tend to look at it that way too. Should and why to watch this film? Absolutely. In my opinion, like almost all of the Golden Age Martino Gialli, this is a excellent example, one of the best. This might be perhaps one of the most suspenseful and cinematic Gialli. I want to say it is the most, but you know, it's one where you can always come up with another example. So I don't want to overextend that. But in some ways, this story is simpler, but it makes up for it in terms of visual storytelling and just Hitchcockian suspense. So if you're a fan of Hitchcock, like myself, or you like the really suspense angles of stuff, I think you will really, really like this film, in particular the third act. And I think that's where this film goes from a very, very solid film to an excellent film, perhaps a masterpiece even. Okay, so let's get into a couple of the talking points here. As I said, this sort of like Bay of Blood and Stage Fright is a very kind of slasherish bridge into that genre. So I think this can serve as a really nice sort of move into there. One thing that's also notable about this is there's a lot of leery locals. It's a troupe of people, so very much Bava-ish, if we think about Blood and Black Lace or $5 on August Moon, where we have a bunch of people put together and you're not necessarily sure who the killer is, but you do know that a lot of people are going to get killed. Also a very slasherish kind of collection of different people. And there's a lot of creativity with the kills and things like that. And you could tell that this is not the first time around the block for Gastaldi or Martino. These guys are mixing it up. There's a lot of varied kills. In particular, the first half of this film really behaves a lot like a slasher, where we're going to these different settings and things like that. There's a really vicious, brutal kill in the mud that happens early on. There's some creative lighting with car lights and whatnot. A lot of creativity in the kills. So another kind of area where it overlaps a lot with kind of the slasherish appeal. One other thing I wanted to note too is this film is set exclusively in Italy. It's not jet set like of the other Martino Giallis. And the Italian locations are just great. And Italy, in my opinion, in terms of a filming location, is just undefeated. It's one of my favorites personally, and a huge reason why I like the Gialli and Poliziotteschi genres. This one takes place in Perugia, which is a college city. Surprise, surprise. Makes a lot of sense contextually once you know that. And it's also, interestingly, for me at least, a important site because it actually happened. This woman, Amanda Knox, went to college to the same school that I did at the same time, University of Washington, and she was studying abroad, and she ended up getting accused of murder. And it's one of those crazy stories that you don't necessarily believe until you learn that it's absolutely true. And it's one of those where you could make the case that the investigators of Amanda Knox had seen one too many of these films and came up with absolutely crazy psychobabble to explain what had happened. So anyways, a murder mystery, a real-life murder mystery. Not funny for Amanda Knox, but a really interesting connection for me when I learned that it's set in kind of the same place, just because that trial was really, really wild. So if you're not sure what I'm talking about, you can Google that or Wikipedia that if you are interested. And yeah, so for me at least, if you're a fan of pure cinema and just the way of visual storytelling and being able to tell different things, I think you're really, really going to like this third act. The third act, in my opinion, is what really, really elevates this film. And I think that third act in particular is what makes this Giallo really stand out and it's be super memorable. I think there's an alternate universe where we think about just the different Gialli that had been made by the time this one's created. If Argento has maybe his 5 days in Milan is a bigger success, or he just never comes back to the genre film or Giallo films in general, or goes some other way rather than coming back with like a huge bang at Deep Red and Suspiria and all that stuff. You could make the case that this is kind of like that last great Giallo until Deep Red. And so this could have been kind of like that Deep Red punctuation, exclamation mark at the end of kind of that first golden age of Gialli. And I think it's certainly for Sergio Martino's filmography, it is a big, big highlight in terms of that. The plot construction is really, really smart the way it takes place. So in the first 45, 50 minutes of the film, very, very standard slasher, and you might be wondering why this is kind of like one of the, considered one of the great ones. And then there's a knock on the door, and then in my opinion, it goes from good to great, where we cut on this little bell. There's some great sound effects here. And then we go into the third act, where we have Susie Kendall, who up to this point, we're not even sure if she's the main protagonist. We would assume that Danny, I actually did on my first viewing, assume that Danny, one of the other girls, is the main protagonist. But at this point, she wakes up. She had taken sleeping pills, she had injured her leg, and she wanders out into the living room, and she realizes that all of her friends have been killed, and she is trapped in there with the killer. So of course, what ensues is sort of this cat and mouse game. But because we don't have any characters that want to acknowledge the other one is there, there's no conversation or anything like that. It has to be done completely visually. So I think Martino and Gastaldi, to the extent that Gastaldi wrote these things, did a great job of just crafting this way in a very, very visual, very clear way. And in some ways, it's kind of just like this lost art in the times where we over-explain things and things like that. But it's a masterclass in just sort of suspense. Different sound design, the film gets very, very quiet, and so when we hear the killer just chopping up the bodies with like a hacksaw, we hear those sound effects, and they're just very extra gruesome because of the way that the different film is designed, where we know that Susie Kendall's character has to keep really, really quiet. So I really, really like how all of that is designed. That last 30 minutes in particular, minus maybe the final fight, which is actually surprisingly good, but does feel a little bit, less great than the rest of the finale. I think it's just immaculately designed. And again, Gastaldi with his different keys and things like that, and locked rooms, the way they come up with the last sort of twist where Susie Kendall needs to get out of the room and needs to knock the key out, and so she puts a paper down, and then the killer ends up helping her. It's just a really delicious twist, and for someone like myself, I just eat that stuff up. I think that stuff is super great. So I love the way that Martino plays with you and just is so patient in his storytelling. Some people might find it slow if you're not into that sort of filmmaking, but for me at least, I love that purely visual, sound designed filmmaking that's going on. Another way that this film sets itself apart, to go into a couple more of my other talking points, is the score. Rather than having a Bruno Nicolai score, we have a De Angelis Brothers score, who Martino would work a lot with. They also worked a lot with Castellari. And it's a different sound. It's more kind of this rock sound that's a little more modernized. It's played when kills are happening, which reminds me a bit of kind of Argento set pieces. So I think that's an area where they overlap a bit. Same thing with kind of the dolls, the children's stuff here. It's definitely kind of a reoccurring trope in Argento films, but just kind of giallo in general. And I also really like, I mentioned this earlier, how the film is very, very decentralized. How we don't necessarily have that main character that we're following. And I think that's a way that this film really sets it apart from all the other different Martino Giallis that he has, where from the case of Strange Vice of Mrs. Ward, her name is literally in the title, and it's clear from kind of the get-go that we're going to be following Edwidge Fenwick around. Case of A Scorpion's Tail plays around with that and has some fun with that, but that's a case where we have kind of our centralized person. It gets decentralized for a little bit, and then it gets refocused. Same thing happens here, except the switch into kind of like the primary focus becomes Susie Kendall isn't obvious until pretty late in the film, definitely over half. And so really she's only the lead for the last act of the film, which I think is a really, really interesting choice. And you can tell that these guys are just playing around with the story and stuff like that. They've done kind of your standard giallos. This one doesn't have any sort of inspiration from those jet set ones, kind of those pop Freudian psychology. We're very much stuck in just the two locations, one, the college town, and then when they finally go out of town. So again, like a lot of the Martino ones could definitely be classified as an F giallo, but it's one where all the main protagonists are women, and it's not immediately obvious that Susie Kendall would be kind of your final girl here. So, again, really, really great film. I strongly recommend Torso, of course. I think it's one of the absolute great Giallis here. This is my third time viewing it, and it's definitely one that I'll probably be revisiting pretty consistently for a long time. I think it's just a really, really well-constructed film. Couple last things to mention, too. I think a lot of America, I think, is a somewhat prudish culture to begin with. I listened to a couple podcasts here. Just can't get past like the nudity and the leery locals in the film. There is a lot of nudity in this film. The locals are very leery. That's part of it. I don't know. I kind of just moved past it. I guess I'm used to it at this point. You do get a lot of boobs in this film, more than probably the other Martino films. But I think, I don't know. I mean, it's part of the era that it takes place. So, I mean, we could have that conversation of being super male gazy or not. And you can certainly make the case, but for me at least, I think this film offers a ton of stuff that's absolutely worth kind of following. Who won? I think definitely Sergio Martino here. I think it's a very, very focused film, which is interesting because he would go to this kind of like mixed buffet of stuff when he did his next quasi-giallo and the Suspicious Death of a Minor. This one, on the other hand, is like, hey, I have these 2 or 3 things that I really want to focus on, and I really want to make it great. And I have this great idea for a third act that we're going to make purely visual. And then he just went out and executed it. So I think it's a really, really focused direction. I think it's as clear of an example of someone, of a Martino film where it's like, it's very obvious he knows what he wants in there. And I think the first 45 minutes, 50 minutes, while it's not as strong as that last bit, does really help to set that up. and it kind of keeps you off balance in that way. So the last act in particular is just so gripping. Double feature, the traditional double feature for this was apparently Texas Chainsaw Massacre, which is, I think, a little bit too much of an adrenaline overload for this film. Certainly a very suspenseful double feature. So I'm going to go classic, go to Blood and Black Lace. On the surface, very, very different films coming out about a decade apart, but they both kind of have the same idea where you have this troupe. You're not necessarily sure who is your main character, like the main person you're following around. And it's obviously kind of a Giallo format and a slasher format that would be copied many times over and over. But it's one where, I think there's a reason they do it that way, and I think it's a fun little trope that they do. So I considered that, and I considered Strange Fright, which is kind of the, has some similarities to this, leaning even more into the slasher end of things that would come later. But I think Blood and Black Lace is what I go with. Just kind of seeing this as a very much more updated 1970s version versus kind of the 1960s Gialli that Blood and Black Lace is. So those are two absolute classics. Those definitely are in the top 10 Giallos, in my opinion. Rating, going to give this a 9.5. Really, really like this film. And I just love what Martino does, especially in that third act. I think it's no coincidence that of my three favorite Martino Gialli films, they all have just kind of genius third acts kind of put together. Your Vice's Locked Room and Only I Have to Kill It really just slow burns and slowly builds up to that point. And this one, it's kind of like more of a complete left turn, or we're taking a total detour from what the film had focused on so far. So really, really like that about this film. Okay, let me know what you think about this film, where you place it in terms of the Martino Gialli, or if this film makes your top 5 or top 10 Gialli too. Be very curious. So thank you all for tuning in. I will see you all next time. Cheers.